I have the honor of introducing our guest speaker this morning. 16 years ago, when we started this church, we made a statement that I hope is still true. And we said, we don't want to start a church for us. Yes, it's for us. But if we build a church for us, that church will die out. And we said we wanted to build a church for our kids. We wanted to lay a foundation that they can build on. That's a win. A year ago, right now, our son Miles was receiving invitations to colleges and universities like Harvard and Yale. And I don't say that on the front end to be the proud dad or to say, you should listen to Miles because he's so smart. Instead, I think we should listen to Miles for the reason he didn't go to Harvard or Yale, even though he was qualified. I asked him last summer, so what do you do with these stacks of invitations from Ivy League schools? And his response was, I don't know why I would go in debt for the next 20 years to do a job that I can learn on my own. And whereas at my age, when I was his age, I would have told everybody, yeah, I got asked to Harvard, right? Whereas anybody else may have taken that invitation as kind of a badge of honor. Yeah, I went to Yale or Harvard. I was like, I don't need that for affirmation. I don't need that little badge of honor. It's as if he embodied that statement, in the world but not of the world. This is the same kid who, on the way to coffee one Monday afternoon, and he was strapped in his baby seat. He's barely learned the basics of the English language, and as the three of us are driving to coffee, he starts to lose his mind in the back seat of the car. Mom, Dad, look! Mom, Dad, look! What, buddy? Like, what? He's so excited. And he said, the moon. The moon is out. And what I love about that moment is he saw something that we see all the time, but he saw it with fresh eyes. The moon, Dad, the moon is out during the daytime. Like in his mind, the moon, that's a nighttime thing. Now see, we've all grown accustomed to seeing the moon sometimes in the middle of the day. And then you see it, and so then you stop seeing it. And what I love about that, and what Miles, I think, brings over and over and over, is sometimes we see something. Sometimes those of us as boomers and Gen Xers and millennials, we've been taught something, handed something, we see something a certain way because that's the way that we've always seen it. And sometimes it's a young person that comes along and says, man, I got fresh eyes and I am seeing something that you're seeing, but you're not seeing it. I want you to see the moon differently. I want you to be excited that the moon is out during the day. Isn't this what the Protestant Reformation was all about? Is that Martin Luther came along and he's like, look, we're seeing it, but we're not seeing it. We're seeing grace, but we're not seeing grace. That's our speaker today. This is the kid that I watched through high school become the proverbial designated driver of his friend group. It was like Miles was always the anchor in the friend group. Whenever there was conflict, gossip, tension, you could overhear Miles, whose bedroom is on the other side of the wall from my home office, working tension out, offering empathy and wisdom and challenge to his friends to I think, and trying to connect people and get them to hear each other where they weren't hearing each other. This is a kid that now at 19 and isn't a kid anymore. At 19 is better at guitar playing at 19 than I am to this day. Is better with his money and financial investments than I've ever been my whole life. And my joke with him this summer is, how does it feel to drive a car better than your old man? And I don't say that to point out, look at what a successful person he is, and so you should listen to what he has to say. I point that out because he is not me. He is my son. He is our son. But he doesn't live in the shadow of his father. He is his own person. He is the person that God created him to be, with the observations and the voice that God created him to have. And the only shadow he lives under is the shadow of the Almighty. So when I think of you, Miles, I think of this verse from 3 John, when John writes this: I have no greater joy than to hear that my children are walking in the truth. Would you guys please open your minds and your hearts to our son, Miles Danger.
Morning, church family. A little weird to get on the stage right now instead of off of it. I'm used to it the other way around. I never thought I'd be preaching. I'm the kid who just 2 years ago took a 0 on an assignment because I was happy with a perfect score on the written part and refused to speak. I'm not a speaker. So when I felt God about a month ago telling me to preach, my guard immediately went up. I was immediately, nope. I've got my ministry. I do worship. I do my thing. That's good. But I felt God telling me to preach. I didn't even know what about at the time. I was like, but he just told me to preach. A couple days later, I felt him give me some material that I was praying about and working through. And I remember it was a Friday night when I finally said to myself, okay, I'm going to put something down on paper. I'm going to do this. I hadn't told anyone yet that I was even thinking of this. 12 hours later, my dad announces that he's taking a sabbatical. And I'm just like, oh, this is going to be one of those God things, isn't it? So that's how we got here. When you ask a child, like a 2-year-old, where food comes from, they'll probably say, well, it comes from mom or it comes from dad, right? And they get a little older and you ask them again, they'll say, well, food comes from the fridge. And when they get older still, they'll say, well, food comes from the store. And then when they get older again, they'll say, well, food comes from a farm, right? And the thing about that is none of those answers were incorrect. They were all correct answers. But there was another level of nuance, right? Another layer to the answer that was important when you're asking certain questions about where food comes from. I think a lot of us approach the idea of God's perfection, God's divinity, with a very from-the-fridge level of nuance, myself included. When I thought of God's divinity and God's perfection, I often thought of it as, well, God is perfect, and so every action he takes and every reaction he has, everything he says, everything he does is inherently perfect through every lens for everyone forever, period. Right? Because he's perfect, so everything that flows out of him should be perfect. But that very black and white view of God's perfection starts to fall apart as soon as you look into the Bible. I mean, as early as Genesis 6:6, we see God having regrets or God changing his mind. And all throughout the Bible, there's examples of God changing his mind on things. In 1 Samuel, this is very clear. In 1 Samuel chapter 15, verse 11, it reads, I regret that I have made Saul king because he has turned away from me and he has not carried out my instructions. And then what's interesting is just a couple verses later in the same chapter, verse 29, he says, he who is the glory of Israel does not lie or change his mind, for he is not a human being that he should change his mind. And then a couple verses later, he bookends the same chapter, reiterating, and the Lord regretted that he had made Saul king over Israel. The thing about God is he's omniscient, right? He knows the plans he has for you, he knows the plans he has for me, and he knows the plans he has for himself, which means that when he made Saul king, he knew he was going to regret it. What do we do with that? How do we justify a perfect God with the fact that he makes decisions that he himself knows he's going to regret? Right, because it seems like a contradiction. If the action of making Saul king was a perfect action, then to regret that would be imperfect. But if the action of regretting it was perfect, it would imply that to make Saul king was imperfect. Right? It seems like a contradiction. About a year ago, I made the choice not to go to college. Dad kind of stole my thunder on this one, thanks for that. A year ago, though, I chose not to go to college. I had a lot of people in my life telling me I needed to go to college for one reason or another. Not parents, but family members, friends, peers, coworkers, teachers. A lot of people telling me that I needed to go to college, and I chose not to. The thing is, I was not scared to tell my parents that I was not going to go to college, right? I don't have an older sibling who I watched choose not to go to college, and yet I knew that they wouldn't have a bad reaction. I knew how it would be received. My best friend at the time, Larry, also chose not to go to college, albeit for different reasons. And his Oma, who he lived with, his grandma, she was very controlling and very selfish. And I remember Larry saying to me, man, I'm scared to tell my Oma that I'm not going to college because she's not going to take it well. And he was right. When he told her, she did not take it well. She was not happy about it. I remember one notable time I was at his house, and I think he went off to use the bathroom or something, and I was alone with his Oma for a few minutes. And she did the thing that old people sometimes do, where they're just telling you, they're just asking a question, but they don't want an answer. They just want you to agree with them, right? So she was all, I don't know why. I don't know why he's not going to college. He's so smart, and he did so well. I'm like, he's told you why. Have you asked him? I didn't say that, but I was thinking it. But the point is, Larry and I both knew how our respective guardians would react, even though we had never seen it modeled. And the reason is both of us knew the contents of our respective guardians' hearts. I know what's in my parents' heart, and so I knew that they would take it well, that they would understand my decision. And Larry knew that his Oma, for all her love, had a lot of selfishness and a lot of control in her heart, and so he knew how she would take it as well. When you react to something, it's not arbitrary. It doesn't stand alone. A reaction is just an expression of what's in your heart, right? It's just an expression of what's in your heart. And I think this is a good starting point to look at what God's perfection really means. I want to read a passage from Exodus chapter 35, verses 5 through 7. And in this passage, Moses had come down from Mount Sinai, and he had the Ten Commandments, and he had found the golden calf, and so he smashed the tablets, and he was angry. We've heard this story before. So in this passage, he went back up the mountain to get the commandments from God for a second time, and this is what the Lord says. Then the Lord came down in the cloud and stood there with him, and proclaimed his name, the Lord. And he passed in front of Moses, proclaiming, the Lord, the compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness, maintaining love to thousands and forgiving wickedness, rebellion, and sin. Yet he does not leave the guilty unpunished. He punishes the children and their children for the sin of the parents to the third and fourth generation. We've heard this before, at least in some sense, right? This is the classic slow to anger, rich in love that we've sung before. But I want to look at the significance of what he's saying in this context specifically, right? So he starts off with the Lord, the compassionate and gracious God. This is a strange thing to say in this context here when you look at it, right? Because the Israelites, they're wandering through the desert. They are hungry, they're starving, they are hot. I don't think they're feeling a lot of love. I don't think they're feeling a lot of compassion and graciousness right now. I don't think that's the first thing on their mind, right? But God leads with his compassion and graciousness. The thing about compassion and graciousness is that they are reactionary traits, right? You can have small talk with someone you've never met before for 10 minutes and walk away, and you can get a pretty good sense of their happiness or their sadness or their energy levels, to some extent at least. You don't get a sense for their compassion or their graciousness until you see them react to something, right? You don't know how compassionate someone is until you watch them either choose compassion or selfishness. You don't get a sense for someone's graciousness until you watch them choose forgiveness or to hold a grudge. They're reactionary traits. right? He could have led with action. He could have said, the Lord who delivered you from from Egypt. He could have said, the Lord who destroyed Pharaoh's armies for you. I think that would have meant a lot more at the time to the Israelites, but he didn't. He led with a description of his reactionary nature, his compassion and his graciousness. And this continues, right? Slow to anger, abounding in love. Anger and love don't exist in a bubble. They don't exist in a vacuum. They have a direction, an object, right? An emotionally healthy person doesn't go home and just feel, oh, I have a bubble of love. I just so much love towards nothing at all, or anger towards nothing at all, right? You can love your spouse. You can love a food, a place, a thing. You can be angry at a coworker or a boss or a situation, but it has a direction. It has an object. It is a reaction to some stimuli. It's a description of God's reactionary character. And this continues still when he says, maintaining love to thousands and forgiving wickedness, rebellion, and sin, but does not leave the guilty unpunished. It's a reaction to sin, to human brokenness. God and Moses go on to make an agreement and then receive the Ten Commandments. This is so profound. The only thing God deems it important to remind Moses of before giving the 10 most important commandments in all of human history is a description of his nature as a reactionary God. We think of God as actionary, but he is reactionary. He's not mechanical, he's responsive. Have you ever been stuck in the middle between two people where, two family members or two friends are fighting, and it's like there's nothing you can do that's going to make everyone happy. There is nothing you can do, no side you can take where both people are going to be happy. Because humans are broken and sinful, and so everyone's a little bit wrong and a little bit right, the only thing you can do is choose to love them and do what's right. But you can't do that without hurting someone. Someone is always going to be hurt because sin exists. So is it possible for God to have a reaction that feels perfect and never hurts anyone through every lens when he's reacting to broken, sinful, messy people? There's always going to be a backside to that. So it's a contradiction for God's reactions to be perfect inherently, because it's a reaction to broken, messy people. Right? God's perfection doesn't lie in the actions themselves that he takes. God's perfection is in his heart. It's in his character. God's perfection exists because God is perfect in compassion and graciousness in his heart. And so every reaction he has is an expression of his divine compassion, right? God has a relational holiness, not an objective holiness, but a relational holiness in every reaction that he has. What if God had never made Saul king, right? Because it looks like a contradiction when he regrets making Saul king. You might say, well, why didn't he just not do that, right? But the Israelites, they demanded a human king, and God told them no. He told them what would happen, and they demanded a human king anyways. You think they would have just given up and said, okay, fine, we'll follow you, God? I don't think they would have, right? I think God saw that even though he knew it was going to hurt, even though he knew what was going to happen to the Israelites because of his choice to make Saul king, he saw that the most compassionate thing he could do for his people was to give them a human king, let them learn the hard way, and push them back on track when they felt the consequences of that, right? It was the most compassionate thing he could do for his people. But God's not a spiteful God, is he? He's not petty, right? So he could have come down in a burning bush after everything that had happened and said, look, Saul turned his back on me. I told you what would happen. Now I'm going to let the Amalekites come in and take your land and your people because you have turned your back on me. He could have, but he didn't because he's not spiteful, right? He's not petty. And so because he is compassionate, because every reaction he has is an expression of his divine compassion, the most compassionate thing he could do for his people, because he loves them and feels for them, is to regret making Saul king. It's not a contradiction. It's not two things that contradict each other. They are separate expressions of God's perfect compassion and love for his people. Not a contradiction. I want to circle back to 1 Samuel 15:29 here for a minute, where the Bible says, he who is the glory of Israel does not lie or change his mind, for he's not a human being that he should change his mind, right? So we've justified that God can be perfect and still regret things, but yet it says here that he does not change his mind in the first place. But I think I think changing your mind is interpreted in a very human sense, because when we change our mind on something, what we really mean is we change our heart. We change our mind because we change how we feel about something. And that's a key difference here, because God's heart doesn't change. I, in the past, made some very selfish and prideful decisions, and there's things I know I've said and done that have hurt people. And I regret those things, right? And I regret them because of the damage they did, and I regret them because of what they were, yes. But what I mean, and what most people mean when they say they regret something they've done, is I regret who I was. I regret those things because I regret that it was an expression of what was in my heart, and I allowed selfishness and pride to overshadow God's love in my heart. It's a regret of character, not a regret of the action. God can regret his actions because he feels for his people, and even though he knows they were the right thing to do, he feels for his people, and there's consequences to your actions when you are reacting to broken, messy people. But God doesn't regret his character because he knows that no matter what he did, it was the most compassionate thing he could do. It's not a contradiction to any of this. It's a statement on God's unchanging, divine compassion. So let's look at this in the big picture, right? We have the Old Testament and the New Testament, two very, very separate, different, I should say, sections of the Bible. Because the Old Testament we usually think of as the authority and the rules and the angry God part of the Bible. And the New Testament is the love and the compassion and the forgiveness side of the Bible. And I don't think we appreciate enough the contrast between these two sections, right? Because we have a God who is unchanging in character and yet seems so different in these two different sections. And I think this is why. I think this expression of his compassion is why. Right? In the Old Testament, the Israelites were incredibly rebellious. They were horribly rebellious. Everything they did, every time God got them back on track, they would just stray right back away. They would demand a human king over and over again in different ways. They couldn't submit to God's will. And so I think God said, look, I can't do my work on earth through you. I can't do the things I need my people to do until you first learn to submit to my will. That is step one. You need to learn to submit to my authority. So before I can do anything else with you, right, you need to learn my authority. Here's 613 rules. I don't care if they seem fair. I don't care if they make sense. You need to learn to submit to my authority before I can use you the way that I need to use you. So we get to the New Testament, and we have the Pharisees, right? And they're the antagonists, in a way at least, throughout the New Testament, because they seem to be addicted almost to these rules, to these blindly submitting to God's authority. And the thing is, say what you want about them. Yeah, their hearts probably weren't in the right place for it, but they were really good at these rules, at following these rules. And I think this is why Jesus came back when he did. It's like, okay, my people have finally, for all their flaws, they have learned to at least try to follow my will to a point where I'm ready for the next step, right? God was ready for the next step in his plan. You've learned my authority, you've learned my will. Now it's time to learn my love and my compassion, and that's where we get Jesus. It's a separate expression of God's compassion through his people. Matthew 5:17 is a verse. It's from the Sermon on the Mount story, and it goes, "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them." And this is a verse used by a lot of Bible-thumping Christians to say, well, look at the Old Testament, look at all these rules. We still have to follow these. Jesus is saying he didn't come to get rid of those. But I think there's some nuance here to the word fulfill. Because this is a strange word in this context, right? If you arrest someone for breaking the law, you might say, oh, I enforced the law, or I upheld the law. But you wouldn't really say, I fulfilled the law. It's not, I think there's an extra requirement to fulfill the law, which means to fill the original purpose of the law, right? Jesus didn't just come to enforce those Old Testament laws. He came to fulfill their purpose, which was to show his people God's authority. And so to fulfill that purpose of God's authority is to express God's compassion through Jesus' love and forgiveness. That's what it means to fulfill the law in this context, I think. So have we really done this as Christians? Right? I mean, we hear the story of the tax collectors where Jesus, he invited a tax collector into his house. He dined with them. He made one a disciple, right? And it's easy for us to read that story and get the point and then completely miss the point, right? Because we don't hate tax collectors. We don't go home and go, oh, those tax collectors are the ones messing with God's will, right? We don't feel the way about tax collectors as they did back then. But we have our own tax collectors now. Everyone does. And it's easy for us to point out other people's tax collectors, right? Especially when you follow more on the progressive side of churches, right? It's easy for us to look at the church in America and say, well, the LGBT community, they're the tax collectors nowadays, right? And that's true, right? Jesus, we have a book of the Bible, a gospel written by a tax collector, and here we are kicking gay people out of leadership at churches. The church has their tax collectors, but all of us do as well. I want to flip the script on that, right? Because would you sit down and dine with a Republican who you know voted the opposite of you, who might support things that you hate? Would you sit down and dine with them like Jesus did the tax collectors? And on the other side, if you're a Republican, would you sit down with a Democrat who you think is destroying this country and dine with them like Jesus did? Have we really learned to address our tax collectors and live like Jesus did and love like Jesus did? Because I don't think we did. I don't think we're there yet. Are we ready for Jesus to come back? Because when Jesus comes back, it's going to be to show a new expression of his divine compassion, right? We have Act 1, the Old Testament, where the expression of God's compassion was to learn his will. And then we have Act 2, the New Testament through modern day, where the expression of God's compassion is to learn his love and forgiveness. And I think there's more to God's character than that. And when Jesus comes back, he's going to show us through his compassion a new aspect of God that we have not learned yet. Are we ready for that? Have we really followed through with learning the love that Jesus taught in the New Testament? Have we addressed our own tax collectors? Because every one of us has a tax collector. What would it look like for us to turn our hearts towards God's? When we talk about being a better Christian, we say, I'm going to be a better Christian, we easily turn towards actions or even reactions to say, right, I'm going to volunteer more, I'm going to donate more, give more of my time, do this. And those are all good things. But Jesus didn't have to sit down and make a list like that to do because he was perfect in compassion. And your reactions is just an expression of what's in your heart. What would it look like for us to turn our hearts towards God's and address our own tax collectors and really love the people in our lives unconditionally like Jesus did? I think if we can learn to do that, Christ-like works will just flow out of us naturally because everything we do is just an expression of our heart. So I want to challenge you all this week to look at your life and see who's your tax collector, right? Is it a coworker? Is it a boss? Is it a group of people? A political party? Because everyone has their tax collectors. What would it look like for us to address those and love like Jesus did? I'm going to invite our worship team onto the stage as I close us in prayer today. God, thank you for this opportunity to speak, to share the message that you laid on my heart in these past weeks. Thank you for this day. Thank you for getting us all here safely this morning. I pray that you just help us in the coming days, weeks, in the rest of our lives to see your relational holiness at work in our lives, to see your perfection in ways that it otherwise wouldn't have been apparent. God, I pray that you help us address our own tax collectors, to find what's the roadblock between us and really loving the way you did. God, I pray for Paul doing your work in prison across the state. I pray for Kate and Matiash doing your work across the world. I pray for all the people across the world doing your work who don't have a church to call home, like Paul and Kate and Matiash, who don't have a church praying for them every week. I pray for them because they're doing your work just as much as all the rest of us are. In your name I pray, amen. Thank you.